The morning after we brought Elias back to the basin, the forest in Oregon felt deceptively calm. Not welcoming, not hostile, but balanced in a way that suggested an agreement had been acknowledged without being spoken aloud. Ethan reviewed the footage repeatedly, isolating the frame where the silhouette held for that fraction of a second between the cedars, enlarging it until pixels blurred into abstraction, while Lena layered the audio from the 3 triangulated knocks beneath the low exhale we captured, building a composite that revealed pattern rather than spectacle. And I stood at the edge of camp staring toward the direction of the basin, aware that something fundamental had shifted the previous afternoon. Not in the forest alone, but within us, because restraint had been met with restraint, and that equilibrium felt fragile. Elias arrived shortly after sunrise, moving through the trees without announcement, his presence quieter than our equipment cases. He said little at first, only that the forest had been still through the night near his cabin. No knocks, no pacing, and that stillness carried weight equal to noise. We gathered near the cold fire pit and discussed whether to return immediately or allow space to widen between interactions. Ethan argued for documentation while the boundary was open, saying that we had a rare window of proximity without aggression. Lena remained silent, eyes distant, as if replaying the breath that rolled through the clearing. And I felt caught between urgency and caution. Daniel had likely stood in that same space 15 years earlier, facing similar pressure from men who believed delay meant weakness. And I understood now how easily curiosity turns into insistence. Elias listened to us debate, and then asked a single question that quieted the discussion. He asked whether we intended to step into the circle again. And the way he phrased it carried no accusation, only awareness that crossing that line would not be neutral. I admitted that part of me wanted to map the woven structure more precisely, to determine whether it had been rebuilt over time or remained as ruin, to see if the pattern of breaks suggested habitation or abandonment. Ethan nodded at that, adding that a detailed scan might clarify whether we were dealing with animal architecture or something more complex. Elias held my gaze and said that the last time machines entered that basin, they were not violent at first. They were curious, measuring, testing, and that escalation followed not from attack but from refusal to withdraw. His words lingered in the air like a warning disguised as memory. And yet the pull toward the center persisted, not driven by thrill, but by the need to understand the geometry of what had been lost. Lena finally spoke, suggesting that if we returned, we should do so without floodlights, without drones, without any tool that hummed or cut, only cameras and recorders, mirroring the restraint shown to us. The compromise settled uneasily but definitively, and so by late morning the 4 of us walked once more toward the scar at the heart of the forest, the path now familiar enough to reduce disorientation, yet still layered with tension. Birds watched from higher branches, but did not scatter, the moss beneath our boots absorbing sound, until our approach felt almost ghost-like. And when the basin emerged again between trunks, it appeared unchanged at first glance. The radial arrangement of fallen timber intact, the woven debris still collapsed at the center. But as we drew closer, a detail sharpened into focus that none of us had seen before. Along the inner perimeter of the circle, several saplings had been bent inward overnight. Not broken, not snapped, but flexed deliberately toward the center, their tips interlacing loosely above the moss. a subtle reconstruction forming where ruin had stood. Ethan whispered that it looked like reinforcement. Lena's recorder registered faint rustling, though no wind moved through the basin, and Elias inhaled slowly, saying that 15 years ago the woven structure had taken weeks to flatten completely under machines, and that rebuilding, if it occurred, would be patient rather than immediate. I stepped to the edge of the circle but did not cross, studying the bent saplings and the pattern they created. Not chaotic, not symmetrical either, but functional in a way that suggested shelter or boundary marker. And as I stood there absorbing the change, I felt the first ripple of doubt about our continued presence. Because if something was rebuilding, then something was investing effort. And effort implies intent. Ethan raised the camera cautiously to capture the new formation, while Lena angled her recorder toward the interior. And for a moment, the forest remained quiet enough to convince us that observation would not provoke response. Then from somewhere beyond the basin came a low, resonant knock, singular and deeper than the previous sequences. Not three this time, not triangulated, just one heavy impact that carried through the soil and into bone. Elias did not move, but I saw his jaw tighten, and I understood that the pattern had shifted again, no longer announcing or enclosing but asserting, and standing at the edge of a circle that showed signs of careful reconstruction. I realized that this was no longer simply about what had been destroyed 15 years ago. It was about what was being restored now, and restoration is far more fragile than ruin. The single knock did not echo twice. It did not complete a pattern. It simply settled into the basin like a stone dropped into still water. And in that absence of repetition, there was something more commanding than the triangulated signals of the nights before. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the bent saplings, forming that fragile inward arc, while Ethan slowly lowered the camera, as if sensing that amplification might fracture whatever equilibrium held. Lena's recorder trembled slightly in her hand, though she did not step back, and I stood at the threshold of the circle with the awareness that crossing it now would no longer be documentation, but intrusion into an active reconstruction. The air felt denser than on previous visits, not colder, not warmer, but compressed, as if the basin itself resisted disturbance, and for a moment no one spoke, because language felt too blunt for the precision of what was unfolding. Then Elias said quietly that when something rebuilds, it is testing whether the destruction has ended, and if it is interrupted again, the response will not mirror the first. His words carried no superstition, only observation layered by years of listening. Ethan asked whether we should withdraw immediately, but even as he spoke, another subtle change occurred along the inner perimeter. One of the bent saplings shifted slightly, not snapping, not recoiling, but adjusting, fibers tightening under unseen pressure. From deeper within the timber, Lena's display spiked with a low-frequency vibration that did not translate into audible sound, yet traveled through the soil into our stance, and I felt it in the arches of my feet. A transfer of weight somewhere beyond visible lines, deliberate and contained. Not a charge, but a repositioning, as if something had moved closer to the far side of the basin, without breaking the geometry of concealment. Ethan instinctively stepped back one pace, and I mirrored him. Not out of panic, but recognition that proximity itself might be the catalyst. Elias finally shifted his posture, placing himself slightly forward, yet still outside the circle. and spoke again into the open air, stating that we had seen the change and would not cross, that no cutting would follow, that no machines would return, his tone firm but not pleading. And for several seconds the forest held its layered quiet. Then from behind the densest cluster of cedars, a second knock landed, not aligned with the first direction, but offset by perhaps 30 degrees, establishing a new axis across the basin. Lena whispered that the spatial orientation had changed, that the signals were no longer enclosing camp but defining the circle itself. Ethan glanced at me with the unspoken question of whether we had already gone too far, and I realized that the boundary had evolved from warning to assertion. The bent saplings were not random regrowth, but deliberate redefinition, and our presence at the edge had interrupted a process in motion. I took a slow breath and stepped backward deliberately, increasing the distance between my boots and the mossed perimeter by several feet, signaling withdrawal not theatrically, but physically. And Elias followed without hesitation, Lena and Ethan matching the retreat until we stood among the outer trunks, no longer at the lip of the scar, but within the ordinary forest beyond it. The vibration subsided gradually, not vanishing but diminishing, and the tension in the air loosened just enough to suggest acknowledgement. Ethan lowered the camera entirely, lens pointing toward the ground rather than the basin. And Lena muted her recorder momentarily, an instinctive act of reducing intrusion, and in that collective reduction the forest resumed faint ambient sound. A bird call, tentative at first, then another farther away, the layered system recalibrating around our new distance. I felt a weight lift that I had not fully registered until it eased. Because what had been building in that basin was not aggression, but resistance to repetition. And repetition had nearly occurred when we approached too closely. Elias turned to me then and said that restoration is not a spectacle to be filmed, but a signal to be respected. And the gravity of that distinction settled over me more heavily than any thermal frame or audio spike, because the story I had come to document was no longer centered on what happened 15 years ago. It was centered on what might happen now if we insisted on proof rather than understanding. Ethan finally spoke, voice lower than usual, admitting that pushing further would shift us from observers to catalysts. And Lena nodded in agreement, her earlier tension replaced by something closer to resolve. And as we began walking away from the basin, without turning our backs too abruptly, I glanced once more at the inward bent saplings, forming their fragile arc, and understood that the line had been redrawn, not through violence, but through reconstruction. A quiet, but firm declaration that whatever occupied this forest under the shadow of the legend of Bigfoot was not merely surviving the past, it was actively repairing it, and that repair demanded distance, not documentation. We did not return to camp immediately after leaving the basin. Instead, we stopped along a narrow ridge where the trees thinned just enough to allow filtered light to fall across moss like muted glass. And for the first time since entering the forest in Oregon, I felt the full weight of what restraint required. Ethan set the camera down without powering it off, as if uncertain whether the act of shutting it down entirely would symbolize retreat or wisdom. Lena sat on a fallen log, with her recorder resting idle in her lap, not capturing, not analyzing, simply present. And Elias remained standing, hands clasped loosely behind his back, listening to something beyond our range of hearing. The forest had resumed its layered rhythm, birds tentatively reclaiming airspace, wind redistributing scent and sound through the canopy. Yet beneath that surface balance lingered the memory of the single heavy knock and the second axis that followed, a redefinition of territory that did not rely on spectacle. I finally broke the silence by admitting that part of me still wanted to step into the circle again, not to disrupt, but to understand the pattern of the bent saplings, to measure the arc of reconstruction, to confirm whether what we were witnessing was habitation or boundary marking. And even as I spoke, I recognized the echo of the logging foreman in my reasoning. The subtle shift from curiosity to entitlement masked as documentation. Elias did not scold or argue. He simply said that understanding does not always require proximity. Sometimes it requires absence, and the simplicity of that statement unsettled me more than confrontation would have, because absence meant relinquishing control of the narrative, relinquishing the need to frame Daniel's disappearance within clean edges. Ethan finally turned off the camera with deliberate slowness, the small click of power down sounding louder than any knock we had heard. And in that gesture, there was acknowledgement that not every interaction must be archived to be real. Lena removed the batteries from her primary recorder and placed them carefully into her pocket, reducing the hum of circuitry between us and the forest. And as we sat there with less equipment mediating our senses, I became acutely aware of the subtler signals around us, the direction of wind, the micro shifts in underbrush, the faint but deliberate redistribution of presence deeper within the trees, not retreating fully but adjusting, maintaining distance equal to ours. The mirroring continued even without devices to measure it, and that reciprocity altered my understanding of the entire arc of events. 15 years ago, machines had entered without listening. Gunfire had followed without pause. Destruction had preceded comprehension. And now, standing on a ridge with Elias as witness, we were being offered an alternative pattern, one in which space was negotiated rather than seized. Ethan asked quietly whether leaving the basin undisturbed would truly prevent escalation, and Elias answered that nothing prevents conflict absolutely, but patterns can be shifted before they harden into repetition. Lena added that the 3 knocks had changed since our first night, evolving from enclosure to axis marking, and that evolution suggested adaptive behavior rather than fixed ritual. The term adaptive lingered between us with scientific gravity, because adaptation implies intelligence interacting with environment, and intelligence demands recognition rather than conquest. I felt Daniel's absence more sharply then, not as mystery, but as consequence. Perhaps he had reached this same understanding too late. Perhaps his second shot had been fired at the moment when withdrawal might have altered everything. And the thought carried no accusation toward him, only sorrow for timing. The forest around us seemed to breathe more evenly now, the earlier compression lifting incrementally. And as we finally rose to return toward camp, I made a decision that felt less like surrender and more like alignment. We would not re-enter the circle again during this season of filming. We would document from distance. We would observe reconstruction without measuring it. We would let the basin remain center, without insisting on standing within it. Ethan nodded in quiet agreement. Lena's expression softened with relief she did not voice, and Elias gave a single approving glance that carried more weight than overt praise. As we descended the ridge and the basin fell fully out of sight behind layered trunks, I realized that the story we were telling had shifted irrevocably. No longer a hunt for proof of Bigfoot, but an examination of how boundaries are drawn and redrawn between human intent and something older that resists erasure. And though the forest remained vast and largely unknowable, its response to our withdrawal had clarified one truth. Vigilance does not always manifest as violence. Sometimes it manifests as reconstruction, and whether we respected that reconstruction would determine what followed. By late afternoon, the light over the camp had shifted into that muted amber that filters through fir and cedar like memory rather than illumination. And the forest in Oregon felt balanced again, not empty, not permissive, but stable in a way that suggested a recalibration had completed. Ethan busied himself cataloging footage we had already gathered, careful not to frame the basin as conquest, but as context. Lena organized the audio files into sequences labeled by pattern, rather than spectacle. And Elias sat on a low stump near the perimeter, gaze directed toward the trees as if measuring something intangible beyond sight. None of us spoke for a while because what needed to be decided did not require debate. It required acceptance, and that acceptance settled slowly. Like fog returning after brief sun, I walked to the edge of camp and looked toward the corridor of darker trunks, where we had first sensed enclosure days earlier, remembering the triangulated knocks, the breath that vibrated through bone, the silhouette that stepped back rather than forward. And I understood that the narrative we had been building could fracture easily if we insisted on climax instead of comprehension. Ethan eventually joined me and said quietly that viewers would expect escalation, that withholding the center might feel incomplete, and I answered that incompleteness was the truest reflection of what we had encountered, because whatever moved within those woods under the long shadow of Bigfoot had demonstrated something rarer than aggression. It had demonstrated measured restraint in the face of intrusion. Lena approached then, holding a final playback of the heavy singular knock from earlier that day, the waveform thick and solitary, and she noted that its resonance carried deeper frequencies than the earlier triangulated pattern. As if the message had shifted from warning to declaration, Elias listened once and nodded, saying that declaration was not threat, but statement of presence. A line drawn not to invite conflict, but to prevent repetition, and as dusk settled without further signal, without pacing or breath or shifting shadow, the absence itself became meaningful. The forest no longer pressing at the perimeter of camp, no longer triangulating our position, simply existing beyond us in layered quiet. Ethan powered down the remaining cameras deliberately. Lena removed batteries from the last active recorder, and Elias rose slowly from the stump, brushing moss from his coat, saying that when vigilance does not escalate, it means the boundary has been respected for now. His use of the word now carried deliberate caution, because boundaries remain active, not fixed. And as the final light drained from the canopy and night reclaimed the clearing, I felt a profound shift within myself. I had returned to these woods seeking closure for Daniel, seeking confirmation that his disappearance could be explained by myth or miscalculation. But what I found instead was a pattern, larger than a single event, a cycle of intrusion and correction that did not hinge on monsters or superstition, but on response. And standing there in the dim afterglow with the forest breathing evenly beyond our reach, I made a quiet promise not into a camera, but into the dark itself, that we would leave the circle intact, that we would not test reconstruction for proof, that our presence would not become the next escalation. The silence that followed was not empty but settled, layered with insects and distant wing beats, returning to ordinary rhythm. And in that restoration of ambient sound, I sensed acknowledgement rather than dismissal, not friendship, not alliance, but coexistence maintained through distance. Elias turned toward the path leading back to his cabin, and paused only long enough to say that the forest remembers patterns longer than men remember names. And then he disappeared between trunks without ceremony, leaving the three of us standing at the edge of our small clearing, aware that the line we had approached had not vanished, only clarified, and as night fully enveloped the camp without a single deliberate knock echoing through timber. I understood that this episode had not ended with confrontation, but with negotiation, a fragile equilibrium drawn across moss and memory, and whether it would hold depended entirely on whether we remembered the lesson written not in footprints or footage, but in the deliberate act of rebuilding what had once been broken.